His wife had just closed a $60 billion real estate deal, the biggest in the city's history, but he was unaware, too busy packing his bags to leave her and their newborn twins for her best friend. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom, still wearing the hospital bracelet from delivering their daughter 72 hours ago, watching him fold his designer suits with the same cold efficiency he'd brought to their marriage. He didn't know that while he'd been sleeping with her best friend in hotel rooms across town, she'd been negotiating the acquisition that would make her the most powerful woman in American real estate. He had no idea that the little side project he'd mocked her for pursuing during her pregnancy was actually a multi-billion-dollar empire she'd built in secret. But she knew everything. About him, about her former best friend, about the web of lies they'd spun while she'd carried his children and closed deals that would reshape the Manhattan skyline. As he zipped his final suitcase, completely unaware of what he was walking away from, she made a decision that would shock him to his core. But would her revenge destroy him completely, or would it reveal a truth even more devastating than his betrayal? And what would happen when he finally discovered that the wife he'd abandoned owned everything he'd ever wanted, including his future? The champagne cork hit the ceiling of the Peninsula Hotel's presidential suite with a hollow pop that made Marcus Wellington flinch. He watched Denise, his wife's best friend since college, pour the cristal into two flutes, her red dress sliding up her thigh as she leaned forward. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered like a circuit board, lights pulsing with the rhythm of ambition and money that had always made his heart race faster than love ever could. To us, Denise purred, handing him a glass, to finally being together without sneaking around. Marcus touched his flute to hers, but the guilt that had been absent for the past 6 months of their affair suddenly materialized like an unwanted guest. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, probably another text from Olivia about the twins. Their daughters Emma and Sophia had been born 3 days ago, and he hadn't been to the hospital once since the delivery. He'd told Olivia he was closing a major investment deal in Boston, that he'd be back tomorrow, that he was sorry he'd missed their birth, but business came first. The lie had rolled off his tongue smooth as silk, practiced from months of deception. "You're thinking about her," Denise said, her voice sharpening. She set down her champagne and crossed to him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "About Olivia and those babies." "I'm thinking about how I'm going to tell her," Marcus admitted. "She just had twins, Denise. The timing is—" "There's never a good time to leave someone," Denise interrupted. "You said yourself that the marriage has been dead for years, that she's been obsessed with her work, constantly on her phone with those endless real estate calls, barely noticing you exist. You said you felt invisible." It was true. For the past 2 years, Olivia had transformed from the attentive wife he'd married into someone consumed by what she called her project. Countless late nights, secretive phone calls, meetings she'd never explain. She'd brushed off his questions with vague answers about building something big and securing our future. He'd felt neglected, dismissed, like an accessory to her ambition rather than a partner. When Denise had started showing interest, beautiful, available Denise who actually listened when he talked, who made him feel seen, falling into her arms had felt like coming home. "She won't even fight it," Marcus said, more to convince himself than Denise. "She's been so distant." Half the time during her pregnancy, she was more interested in her laptop than preparing for the babies. I'd come home and find her on conference calls at midnight, talking about zoning laws and construction permits like they were more important than our family. Denise turned him around to face her. "Because they were more important to her. You deserve someone who puts you first, Marcus, who sees you." His phone buzzed again. This time he looked. Olivia's text was simple. "When are you coming home? The girls need to meet their father." No emotion, no pleading, just a statement of fact, as clinical as everything else about her lately. He remembered their wedding 7 years ago, how her eyes had sparkled with tears of joy, how she'd whispered that he was her everything. Where had that woman gone? When had she been replaced by the stranger who spoke in square footage and cap rates? "I'll tell her tomorrow," Marcus said, finishing his champagne in one swallow. "I'll go home, have the conversation, and start the divorce process. It'll be better for everyone in the long run. Better for the girls to grow up with parents who are honest about their feelings than to live in a house filled with resentment. But even as he said it, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he was the only one filled with resentment. Olivia had never shown him anything but quiet patience, even when he'd criticized her work, even when he'd come home late smelling of another woman's perfume. She'd simply nodded, smiled that distant smile, and returned to her endless calls and contracts. Denise kissed him, pulling him toward the bedroom, and Marcus let himself be pulled. He'd deal with reality tomorrow. Tonight he'd pretend that love was as simple as wanting and being wanted, as uncomplicated as champagne and silk sheets, and a woman who made him feel like he mattered. He didn't know that while he was betraying his wife in a hotel suite, she was sitting in a boardroom downtown changing the course of his entire life. He didn't know that the little side project he'd mocked was actually Solaris Holdings, a real estate empire she'd built in secret over 5 years. He didn't know that tomorrow, when he walked back into their home to end their marriage, he'd be walking into a trap of his own making. All he knew was that Denise made him feel alive, and Olivia made him feel invisible. In his mind, that justified everything. He was wrong about that too. The apartment was quiet when Marcus unlocked the door the next afternoon. He'd rehearsed his speech during the entire cab ride from the hotel, had practiced the right tone, firm but compassionate, clear but not cruel. He found Olivia in the nursery, standing between 2 white cribs where Emma and Sophia slept, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect synchronization. She wore yoga pants and one of his old Stanford t-shirts, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked exhausted, beautiful, and far more vulnerable than he remembered. "You're back," she said softly, not turning around. "Did you close your deal?" The lie sat on his tongue like poison. "Olivia, we need to talk. About your affair with Denise?" She turned then, and her eyes were dry. No tears, no shock, just a calm certainty that made his prepared speech dissolve into ash. "Yes, Marcus. I think we do need to talk about that." His blood turned to ice. "How long have you known?" 6 months, Olivia said. "Since the first time you slept with her in that hotel suite you think I don't know about. The Peninsula 20th floor. You charge it to our American Express." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. 6 months. She'd known for 6 months and said nothing, had carried his children and given birth while knowing he was betraying her with her best friend. What kind of woman did that? What kind of game was she playing? "If you knew, why didn't you say anything?" he demanded, anger replacing his guilt. "Why put us both through this charade?" "Because I wanted to be sure," Olivia said, her voice still that maddening calm. "I wanted to see how far you'd go. If you'd be at the hospital when your daughters were born, if you'd choose them over her." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You answered that question pretty clearly." "I'm leaving you," Marcus said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. "I'm in love with Denise. This marriage is over, Olivia. You know it as well as I do. You've been checked out for years, obsessed with your work, treating me like I'm some kind of annoying distraction from your precious business deals." "My precious business deals," Olivia repeated, something dangerous flickering in her eyes. "Yes, let's talk about those. Let's talk about what I've been building while you've been busy cheating on me." She picked up her phone from the changing table and pulled up a news article, holding it out to him. Marcus took it, his hands beginning to shake before he even finished reading the headline. "Mystery mogul revealed. Solaris Holdings CEO closes $60 billion Manhattan real estate deal, biggest in city history." The article featured a photo of Olivia, his Olivia, standing in front of the new Hudson Yards development, wearing a tailored suit he'd never seen, shaking hands with the mayor. The article detailed how she'd spent 5 years quietly acquiring properties across Manhattan, building a real estate empire under a corporate veil so thick that not even the city's savviest developers had known who was behind it. Until yesterday, until she'd closed the largest deal in New York real estate history. This is impossible," Marcus breathed. "You're a real estate analyst. You work from home doing market research. You make $60,000 a year." "I was a real estate analyst," Olivia corrected. "That was my cover while I built Solaris. While you were dismissing my late-night calls as boring work calls, I was negotiating with the Vanderbilts, the Trumps, the Bloombergs. While you were complaining about me being distracted, I was restructuring the Manhattan skyline. And while you were sleeping with my best friend, I was becoming one of the 10 richest women in America. Marcus stared at her, his brain refusing to process what she was saying. $60 billion. His wife, his quiet, distant, supposedly career-obsessed wife, had closed a $60 billion deal. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless, like a figure from a video game, rather than real life. The company you work for, Olivia continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Wellington Investments, the venture capital firm where you're a junior partner. Do you know who owns the building your office is in? The ice in Marcus's veins turned to liquid nitrogen. No. Solaris Holdings. Me. I'm your landlord, Marcus. I have been for 3 years. Your boss, Richard Chen? He's been begging me not to raise your rent for the past 18 months. I've been keeping it artificially low. She tilted her head. That's going to change now. This is insane, Marcus said, backing away from her. You've been lying to me for years, playing some kind of sick game While you what? Olivia's calm finally cracked, her voice rising. While you betrayed me, while you abandoned our children, while you chose my best friend over your own family. She stepped closer to him, and he saw something fierce and terrible in her eyes. I built an empire, Marcus. I changed the face of this city. I created something that will outlast both of us, that will provide for our daughters and their daughters. And I did it all while you were deciding I wasn't worth your time. One of the twins, Emma, started crying, a thin wail that cut through the tension like a knife. Olivia immediately turned to the crib, her entire demeanor softening as she picked up their daughter and cradled her against her chest. The contrast was jarring. The ruthless businesswoman who'd just revealed herself as a billionaire tycoon, now cooing softly to a 3-day-old infant. Get out, Olivia said quietly, not looking at him. Pack your things and get out of my apartment. Your apartment? Marcus laughed, a brittle sound. This is our apartment. My name is on the lease too. No, Marcus. Your name is on a lease for an apartment I own. Through Solaris. This entire building is mine. The lease you signed was a courtesy, and that courtesy is now revoked. She finally looked at him over Emma's tiny head. You have 2 hours to take what you want. After that, the locks will be changed, and security will have orders to escort you out if you return. You can't do this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Looking at her now, this woman who'd hidden a $60 billion secret for 5 years, he realized he didn't know what she could or couldn't do. I can do anything I want, Olivia said simply. I'm the one with the power here, Marcus. I always have been. You just never bothered to notice. She rocked Emma gently, the baby's cries quieting. Denise will be receiving a phone call shortly, by the way, about her job at Lehman Sisters, about how the building they lease their office space in is also owned by Solaris, about how her contract is up for renewal next month. Marcus felt sick. You wouldn't. I haven't decided yet, Olivia admitted. Part of me wants to destroy her for what she did, but another part of me thinks the best revenge is letting you two have each other, letting you build a life together on your junior partner's salary while I raise our daughters in penthouses and trust funds. Her smile was cold. I wonder how long she'll stay interested when the money runs out. He wanted to defend Denise, to insist that their love was real, but the words died in his throat. He remembered how Denise had been attracted to him initially, the Wellington name, the promise of wealth and status that came with marrying into old money. What would happen when she discovered that his trust fund was nearly depleted, that he'd been living off credit cards and his salary for the past 2 years while waiting for his investments to pay off? What would happen when she learned that the wife he was leaving was worth $60 billion? 2 hours, Olivia repeated. The clock is ticking. Marcus stood frozen for a long moment, watching his wife, his stranger wife who'd hidden an empire, gently bouncing their daughter. Then he turned and walked to their bedroom, his mind reeling with the magnitude of his mistake. He'd thrown away everything for a woman who made him feel seen, never realizing that the woman he was leaving had been seeing everything all along and building a kingdom while she watched. The cityscape outside their bedroom window looked different now. Every building, every crane, every construction site could be Olivia's. He'd lived in Manhattan for 15 years and thought he understood how power worked. Who held the keys to the kingdom? He'd been wrong about all of it. He started packing, his hands moving automatically while his brain struggled to catch up. His phone buzzed. Denise, wanting to know how the conversation went. He ignored it. In the nursery, Emma had stopped crying, replaced by Sophia's fussing. He could hear Olivia's soft voice singing a lullaby his mother used to sing to him. When he'd imagined this moment, he'd pictured Olivia crying, begging him to stay, maybe even fighting for their marriage. He hadn't pictured this, her calm revelation of power, the way she'd turned his entire world inside out with a few sentences. He'd wanted to escape feeling invisible. Instead, he'd made himself completely irrelevant. The irony would have been funny if it didn't feel like drowning. The law office was in Midtown, occupying 3 floors of a building that Marcus now knew Olivia probably owned. He sat across from his lawyer, Gerald Davidson, a man who'd been handling the Wellington family legal affairs for 30 years. Gerald looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by something that resembled pity. "Mr. Wellington," Gerald said carefully, setting down the folder of papers he'd been reviewing, "I'm going to be direct with you. This is the worst negotiating position I've seen in my entire career." Marcus had spent the last 2 weeks in Denise's studio apartment in Queens, a far cry from the spacious Tribeca loft he'd shared with Olivia. Denise had been understanding at first, sympathetic about his situation, but as the reality of his financial position became clear, no apartment, limited savings, a salary that barely covered Manhattan rent, her sympathy had begun to curdle into something else. Last night, she'd suggested he ask his parents for money. When he'd explained that his trust fund was controlled by a board that included his father, and that they'd all be furious about the divorce, she'd gone quiet in a way that terrified him. "Just explain it to me plainly," Marcus said, rubbing his temples. He hadn't slept well in days. "Your wife owns everything," Gerald said. "The apartment you lived in, hers. The building your office is in, hers. 3 of the restaurants you frequent, hers. The yacht club where you're a member, the building is hers and she's on the board. Your gym, your dry cleaner, the garage where you park your car, all in buildings owned by Solaris Holdings." He pulled out a map of Manhattan marked with red dots. "These are all confirmed Solaris properties. Your wife owns or has significant stakes in 237 buildings across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens." Marcus stared at the map. The red dots covered it like measles. "How is that possible?" he asked. "How did no one know?" "She used a complex web of LLCs and shell corporations," Gerald explained. "Solaris Holdings itself was buried under 6 layers of corporate structure. She was buying properties through different entities, making it look like dozens of different investors rather than one person. It was brilliant, actually. By the time anyone realized what was happening, she controlled enough of the market to force the consolidation deal, the $60 billion deal. Yes, she'd been acquiring properties for 5 years, but the true genius was in the timing. She waited until she had enough leverage to force the other major developers to either sell to her or watch their projects fail due to zoning issues, access problems, or supply chain complications that she could control. Gerald shook his head in admiration. "She's been compared to Astor and Rockefeller in the financial press. They're calling her the most influential woman in American real estate since Leona Helmsley." Marcus felt like he was going to be sick. "What about the divorce? What am I entitled to?" Gerald's expression grew even more uncomfortable. "That's the problem. You signed a postnuptial agreement 3 years ago." "What? No, I didn't." "Yes, you did. You were refinancing your car at the time, and there was a stack of papers. Your wife told you it was all standard refinancing documentation." Gerald pulled out a copy of the agreement. But buried in those papers was a postnuptial agreement stating that in the event of a divorce caused by infidelity on your part, you would be entitled to nothing from any businesses or assets she'd acquired during the marriage. Marcus grabbed the document, scanning it frantically. There was his signature at the bottom, right next to Olivia's. He remembered that day. He'd been rushing to a golf game, had barely glanced at the papers Olivia had presented. She'd said something about taxes and refinancing, had assured him it was all routine. He'd trusted her. She'd been planning this for years. "She can't do this," Marcus said, his voice rising. "This is entrapment, fraud. She tricked me into signing this." "You signed a legal document without reading it," Gerald corrected. "That's not fraud. That's negligence. And given that you've admitted to the affair, that you left her days after she gave birth to your children, and that you did so for her best friend," he spread his hands, "no judge in New York is going to look favorably on your position. So I get nothing after 7 years of marriage? You'll get visitation rights with your daughters, assuming you want them. You'll be required to pay child support, though given the disparity in your incomes, the amount will be nominal for someone of your wife's wealth, and you'll walk away with whatever assets you had before the marriage, which according to my records is approximately $80,000 in a savings account, and your car, which is leased." Marcus thought about Denise's studio apartment, about how she'd been looking at him differently lately. She'd suggested yesterday that maybe they should take a break until his situation stabilized. He'd seen her Googling how much junior partners at venture capital firms made. He'd watched her face fall when she realized that his family money was tied up in trusts he couldn't access without board approval. Approval his father had made clear would not be forthcoming given the disgraceful way he treated Olivia. "There has to be something I can do," Marcus said desperately. "Some way to fight this." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very gently, "Mr. Wellington, your wife spent 5 years building a $60 billion empire while you were oblivious. She knew about your affair for 6 months and never revealed her hand. She maneuvered you into signing a postnuptial agreement that protected everything she'd built. She waited until after you'd left her and your newborn children to reveal her true position." He closed his folder. "You're not fighting someone who got lucky or made a lucky investment. You're fighting someone who planned every move for years. Someone who's smarter, wealthier, and more connected than you ever imagined. My honest advice? Accept her terms, whatever they are, and try to salvage some relationship with your daughters. Because if you try to fight her in court, she will destroy you so completely that your name will become synonymous with cautionary tale in Manhattan social circles." Marcus left the lawyer's office in a daze. Outside, Manhattan rushed past in a blur of noise and movement. He walked without direction, his feet carrying him automatically. After an hour, he found himself outside his old building, Olivia's building, in Tribeca. He stood on the sidewalk across the street, looking up at the windows of what had been his home. The doorman, Carlos, who'd worked there for 15 years, saw him and looked away quickly. He'd been told. The whole building had probably been told. The man who'd left his billionaire wife for her best friend, thrown away everything for an affair. He'd become a story, a piece of gossip to be shared over morning coffee and evening wine. His phone buzzed. Denise. "We need to talk." He knew what that conversation would be. He'd seen it coming for days, had watched her interest wane as his prospects dimmed. She'd loved the idea of him, the wealthy Wellington heir, the successful investor, the man who would give her the life she'd always wanted. She hadn't signed up for reality, a junior partner with limited prospects, estranged from his wealthy family, with child support payments and an ex-wife who owned half of Manhattan. Marcus didn't go back to Queens. Instead, he walked to Central Park and sat on a bench near Bethesda Fountain, watching tourists take photos and families push strollers. He thought about Emma and Sophia, 3 weeks old now, growing up in penthouses and privilege. They'd have everything: education, opportunity, security. Everything he'd wanted to give them, but never could have on his own. Olivia would raise them to be strong, smart, strategic. They'd probably learn the story eventually, how their father had left right after they were born, how he'd thrown away everything for a woman who'd abandoned him as soon as his money disappeared. He thought about Olivia, about the woman he'd married 7 years ago, and the stranger she'd become. Or maybe she'd always been this person, and he'd simply never bothered to look closely enough. He'd been so focused on feeling neglected that he'd never asked what she was building, never showed interest in her dreams. He'd dismissed her late-night calls as boring work talk when she'd been negotiating billion-dollar deals. He'd accused her of being distant when she'd been carrying their children while reshaping the Manhattan skyline. She'd been extraordinary, and he'd been blind. The sun was setting when Marcus finally stood up, his decision made. He wouldn't fight the divorce. He wouldn't contest the terms. He'd sign whatever papers she presented and try to build some kind of relationship with his daughters, even if they grew up knowing he'd abandon them. He'd live with the consequences of his choices, with the knowledge that he'd held a queen and traded her for a pawn. He called Denise back. The conversation was brief, awkward, ending with the mutual acknowledgement that they'd made a mistake. She was kind about it, kinder than he deserved. She said she hoped he'd find happiness, that she hoped things would work out. They both knew she didn't mean it. Then he called Gerald and told him to accept Olivia's terms, whatever they were. Finally, he called Olivia. She answered on the third ring. In the background, he could hear one of the twins crying. "I'm not fighting the divorce," and he said, "I'll sign whatever you want." There was a long pause. Then Olivia said, "Good, that's smart. Can I see them? Emma and Sophia." Another pause. "You can have supervised visitation every other Sunday, 3 hours, at my apartment, with a nanny present." It was humiliating being supervised with his own children, but he had no leverage to argue. "Okay, Marcus," Olivia said, and her voice was softer now, almost sad. "I didn't do this to hurt you. I built Solaris because I wanted to create something meaningful, something that would last beyond both of us. I wanted our children to have security, opportunity, legacy. I would have shared all of it with you if you just..." She trailed off. "If I'd just stayed," he finished. "If I'd chosen you instead of Denise." "If you'd just seen me," Olivia corrected. "I didn't need you to stay out of obligation. I needed you to look at me and actually see who I was becoming, to be interested in my dreams the way I was interested in yours, to be a partner." The crying in the background grew louder, and she sighed. "I have to go. Gerald will send over the papers." "Olivia," Marcus said quickly before she could hang up, "for what it's worth, I'm sorry. You deserve better than what I gave you." "Yes," she agreed simply. "I did." Then she hung up. Marcus stood in Central Park as darkness fell over Manhattan, watching the lights come on across the city. Somewhere in all that glittering expanse, Olivia was feeding their daughters, building their future, creating an empire that would outlast them all. And he was alone, exactly as he'd made himself, with nothing but regret and the bitter knowledge of what he'd thrown away. The city looked different now that he knew who really controlled it. Every building was a reminder of his blindness, every light a testament to the woman he'd never really known. He'd spent 7 years married to Olivia and hadn't understood her at all. He'd seen what he wanted to see, a neglectful wife, a woman obsessed with boring work, instead of the truth, a visionary building something extraordinary while he complained about not getting enough attention. The worst part was that he couldn't even hate her for it. She'd been planning, building, creating while he'd been destroying the one thing that actually mattered. She'd given him chance after chance to choose their family, to see what she was building, to be part of something bigger than his ego. And he'd chosen Denise instead, chosen validation over partnership, chosen to feel important over actually being important. As Marcus finally left the park and headed toward the subway, he'd sold his car last week to pay rent. He realized that Olivia's revenge hadn't been destroying him financially. That would have been too easy, too clean. Her real revenge was forcing him to live with the full knowledge of what he'd walked away from, to watch from the outside as his daughters grew up in a world of opportunity and wealth that he'd voluntarily excluded himself from. She was letting him live, but making sure that every day for the rest of his life, he'd remember exactly what his betrayal had cost him. It was, he had to admit, absolutely brilliant, and it hurt far more than any amount of money ever could.